In 1849, archaeologists started digging at the ancient site of Nineveh. Their goal was to track down the biblical Assyrians. What they found tore down the walls of history. Ashurbanipal was the second to last king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a learned man, immensely proud of his scholarship. And he collected avidly all the tablets of medicine, of science, of history, and the mystical arts of the greater Mesopotamian area. And these form part of the first known curated library in the world. But Ashurbanipal was also an arrogant man, savage, and this savagery would cause the downfall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The ancient city of Nineveh was put to the flame, turning the library into a giant pottery kiln, baking the cuneiform tablets hard, making them brittle, so as the walls collapsed, the tablets shattered. To date, 30,000 pieces have been discovered in a somewhat less than methodical method. And they are now housed in the endless drawers of the British Museum, where they make up the most complex jigsaw puzzle in the world. For 170 years, Assyriologists have been piecing together this jigsaw puzzle at the rate of 35 pieces per year. AI has helped speed things along a bit, and now we are placing pieces at 350 pieces per year. But no matter how slowly the pieces fall, they are creating a ripple through history. Myth becomes fact, legend becomes history, and the words of the poets become the peer-reviewed words of scholars. I am Enheduanna, lady of the largest heart. I who spread over the land the splendid brilliance of your divinity, you allow my flesh to know your scourging? My sorrow and bitter trial strike my eye as treachery. Here, Enheduanna is berating the all-goddess Inanna, the holder of all me, with a powerful, confident feminine voice that was all but lost to history. This voice started a seismic shift in the thought process of the scientists of the late 19th and earlier 20th century. But it was when they translated the end of Temple Hymn 42. That is when the mega shake hit. The person who bound this tablet together is Enheduanna. My king, something never before created, did not this one give birth to it? The clear claim to authorship challenged long-held assumptions. But the scholars, the men, were so embedded in their thought process that for 50 years they balked at the idea that it was a woman who wrote these words. And not just that, but she signed her name and laid claim to being the first known author in the world. The scholars refuted this. They said, how can we know? We can know nothing about Enheduanna, what she said or did, or even that she could write. But history flows, time goes on, pieces are slowly placed, new libraries are found, and now with the discovery of the Sumerian library of about 1,600 tablets of mainly, it was an administrative library, we know that women were fully integrated in society. We know that this particular library was run by women who were fully engaged in the administration of beer production, bread production, textile production, trade across the known world of the ancient Mesopotamian area. We know now, through these slow translations, that women of that time were fully engaged in economic matters. They had property rights, they had inheritance rights, they had right to rule, they had the right to organize their own marriages and the right to divorce the husbands if they were not satisfied with their choice. We know all these things now. And what we also know now, through the progress of cognitive neuroscience, is that what these ancient scholars, archaeologists, thought back in the 19th and 20th century about women had absolutely nothing to do with these women of ancient times. They were just projecting a bias that had been created over thousands of years and had embedded itself in their thought process. What they were doing is comparing these ancient women to their wives. And this bias affects our understanding of history even today, as those scholars of the late 19th and early 20th century wrote down their words into books, made permanent their thought process. And even today, we read those thoughts and believe they are true. And this brings us to something that cognitive neuroscience has discovered that's very disturbing about how we use our brains. When confronted with new information, factual information, we don't change our minds, particularly if the misinformation that we already have embedded in our thought process revolves around something that is part of our fundamental value system, such as politics or religion, or the belief in a socio-political system in which one gender or race is superior, dominant over another. If this sort of thought process is confronted with new information, people in general don't change their minds, particularly those who are benefited by the old thought process. In their brains, this new information is rejected and the old information is embedded more firmly, more deeply. And we see this happening all over the world today. As new information comes out, as new scientific information comes out, one would think that people would slowly start changing their minds and how they see their world and their place in it. It doesn't. What it creates is something that scientists call backfire. A complete rejection of the new information and an ongoing justifying of the old information. So changing our minds is hard. But even harder is finding the actual point of misinformation that needs to be changed. And harder yet is finding a way to change that misinformation, to update that information without causing backfire. And this is something that I challenge myself to do in every book that I write, in the questions I try and answer through my books. And here it is really a digging down into this trench of thought of why is it that men believe certain things about women. And this backfire, this thing that the brain does, is one of the reasons that I believe that feminism ultimately is a failure. When the early feminists started protesting, started rising up for equality with men, they didn't dig down deep enough into the system to really pinpoint what they were fighting for and what they were fighting against. They just wanted equality on a level within the system that they already were, which was unachievable because they were now head on head with men. And this, of course, caused immediate backfire in the brains of men who fundamentally believed they were superior to women, and this thought process had been in construction for thousands of years. By tracing Enheduanna's story, we can also trace just how far back this goes. Enheduanna's voice rises out of the cuneiform tablets in the library of Ashurbanipal 2,600 years ago, because at that time the scribes were using her words as a decal. It was part of their curriculum to teach them the languages of Akkad and Sumeria and the various cuneiform peculiarities of these languages. But when the scholars were busy practicing their craft by copying out the words of Enheduanna, these words were already almost 2,000 years old. And this is the trench of time, sort of 4,400 years ago, is the trench of time I'm going to dig down in today to try and find particularly words of woman that have influenced history, and occasionally words about woman. So with the discovery of other libraries, such as that of the Great Hittite Empire, consisting of 10,000 tablets, found in 1906 and translated by 1925, our knowledge is no longer only based on ancient ruins, stone and metal that can withstand the entropy of time. We can now base our knowledge on words. We can read the minds of the ancients since this wall was discovered, which is the equivalent of the Rosetta Stone of these ancient languages. The whispers of Enheduanna tell of the ancient origins of the slow domination of the male thought process. Enheduanna is the daughter of Sargon, the first emperor of the Akkadian Empire, and she lives some 4,300 years ago. As the high priestess of Akkad and Sumer, she was in charge of melding the beliefs of the Sumerians with that of the Akkadian temple systems, and probably oversaw a staff of hundreds, if not thousands, of temple workers, and was one of the most privileged women in what already was a steeply hierarchical and patriarchal society. Enheduanna is high priestess for about 40 years and lives to compose hymns and lamentations for all the temples of all the gods, shaping the thought process of Mesopotamia for thousands of years. As her words echo in the library of Ashurbanipal, current scholars have made the case that her thinking echoes in the libraries that we may be more familiar with, the Greeks, the Romans, and even the Bible. As technology tears away the veils of time and forces us to rethink history, there is a growing chorus. This changes everything. We must rewrite history. History must be rewritten. But we don't. And so from the translation of the Temple Hymn 42, it took 100 years for the scholars to generally come to a consensus that, yes, indeed, Inanna was the first known author. But 4,300 years ago, when Inanna was at the height of her powers, in charge of all the gods, she, in moments of personal need, her personal goddess, was a female entity that was thousands of years older yet. Inanna's voice, Inanna's name, there are whispers of it up to 7,500 years ago. And here you have a vase, an alabaster vase, which dates to 6,200 years ago, and the woman on the right receiving tribute is the old Sumerian version of Inanna. Enheduanna writes an exaltation for Inanna, which is the complete reversal of how we would exalt a god today. Queen of all given powers, unveiled clear light, unfailing woman wearing brilliance, cherished in heaven and earth, chosen, sanctified in heaven. You, grand in your adornments, crowned with your beloved goodness, rightfully you are high priestess. Your hand seize the 7 fixed powers, my queen of fundamental forces, guardian of essential cosmic sources. You lift up the elements, bind them to your hands, gather in powers, press them to your breast, Vicious dragon you spew, venom poisons the land, like the storm god you howl. Grain wilts on the ground, swollen flood rushing down the mountain. You are Inanna, supreme in heaven and earth. To quote an Assyriologist responsible for this transliteration, her powers foreshadow the powers of the God of the Old Testament. Only the names have changed. And we shall see later in this presentation that the Old Testament Yahweh was not the first God to cloak himself in the powers of Inanna. Now, before we continue on this trench digging, just to dispel any conclusions about the things we've already found, these women of this ancient time were very powerful, independent. But then, like now, they were a certain kind of woman who could rise in a very steep hierarchy in a very powerful patriarchal state. Women who are capable of everything a man can do, whom I call femen, but they are not representative of everything that femininity can do or can achieve. What these ancient women also tell us is that our idea of female progress, of progressive equality, of liberation, is not new, not modern, not original, or even the most progressive women have ever been within a society. The problem with what we're doing today is we are measuring ourselves against the standard that was set by the men, the Assyriologists, the archaeologists of the late 19th century. Victorian men, Edwardian men, in which period women were the most oppressed, repressed they have been in thousands of years. That is the low standard against which we modern women measure our progress. Another thing that these ancient civilizations in the Bronze Age show us, now that we have found the libraries of various other civilizations, the Hittites, the Akkadians, the Sumerians, and of course the Egyptians, which we are familiar with, the scholars have also found blueprints. They now know from the administrative libraries how these cities functioned. And with the help of AI, we can recreate virtual cities, and we can see that these were not dusty old ruins in which people grubbed about in the earth. These were highly civilized centers. This was a global conglomerate of highly integrated transactional treaties and of course war, but trade and treaties and integration of massive powers that were equal. The Hittites, the Egyptians, and the Babylonian Assyrian were equal in power. But 3,200 years ago, between 3,200 and 3,100, all of that collapsed. The Hittites vanished, the old Babylonian Assyrians vanished, the Egyptians were reduced to a fraction of what they were. The Assyrians that remained were a fraction of what they were. 60% of the Mesopotamian civilized centers vanished, reverting to what we would casually call the Stone Age. And there they languished for 600 years. It took 600 years from that collapse to the revival of Nineveh and the ancient library of Ashurbanipal, where we started our dig. And as the scientists are piecing together the information, they are coming to a conclusion. They have reached a consensus that this collapse, the catalyst of this collapse, was climate change. That the stability of these civilizations depended on a stable climate. And as the climate changed, all of these interlinking links in the chain started breaking, and eventually the entire system just collapsed. a cautionary tale for our modern world. As we dig down into this trench of time, into the words of the ancients, the scholars can start making comparisons between the words of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Hittites, the Neo-Assyrians, the Egyptians, across a span of 2,000 or more years. They can put the words next to one another, and they can see the similarities, but also subtle differences. And the differences that strike my eye are the differences in the place of woman in society. Women in society from the age of the Akkadian Sumerians, their standing in society slowly but surely regressed. And then rose again, and then regressed again. And there is a clear pattern that is arising, which I will expound upon later on in this presentation. But what is apparent is how the standing of woman in power changes. And we can see this through the change, the evolution of the goddess Inanna. By the time of the Neo-Assyrians of 2,600 years ago, the time of Ashurbanipal, Inanna had become Ishtar. She was stripped of all but two of her powers, war and sex, and she was stripped of all of her clothing and became this highly sexualized, semi-human creation. The rest of her powers, all of her meh, were bestowed upon the Assyrian god Marduk, who was the god of all gods within the Assyrian belief system. The creation story of the Assyrians and their god Marduk was usurped from the earlier creation stories of the Sumerians and then tweaked to reflect the machismo of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But even in this extremely macho world, a woman still rose to power. About 2,800 years ago, Shamu Ramat, High Heaven, ruled Neo-Assyria. She was such a powerful military leader that the Greeks considered her one of the most powerful women of the age. And in their translations, we know her as Semiramis. But it is in Semiramis's legacy that we start seeing how women through the ages have been subject to the thought process of men who were firmly embedded in the patriarchy. During the Dark Ages of Europe, when the power of Rome was shifting from the state to the church, the focus on the achievement of Semiramis shifted from her military and strategic genius to her supposedly overwhelming and uncontrolled sexual desire. I think we're starting to see a pattern here. Because of these sexualized versions of her story, the legacy of Semiramis is contradictory. On one side, the Christian tradition has condemned her, without any supporting evidence, as a lustful, treacherous seductress, the whore of the allegorical Babylon, a biblical symbol of lust and evil. On the other, in the objective historical record, in which Babylon is a city and not a symbol, her military power and commanding skills were seen as so exceptional that comparisons have been made with Alexander the Great. And here is another reason that I believe feminism has failed woman. I paraphrase the author Michaela Murguia. She says, men's history and achievements are like torches that are handed over from generation to generation. They get embedded in history. Women's achievements, however, are like a little lamp lit in the darkness and quickly blown out. And here I go on to conclude that the blowing out of this lamp is not only by men, but also by a particular kind of female. Once again, the femen who are successful in this particular patriarchal construct, who support the men who denigrate the woman. and we shall get to that later in the presentation. So Semiramis's reputation languishes in this sort of twilight zone until approximately 600 years ago, in 1405, she gets a brief reprisal, a brief burnishing of the reputation through the author Christine de Pizan. She is a professional writer resident in Venice, and she has just read a book, Lamentations, a 13th century book, in which the author laments marriage and how miserable women make men in marriage. And although Christine de Pizan is living in Venice, one of the most liberal city-states of Europe of the time, we shall see how she still frames herself within a very narrow constraint of what men, Christian men, the church has defined a woman is. Let me read to you from her book. The Book of the City of Ladies opens with Christine reading from Lamentations. And upon reading the words, Christine becomes upset and feels ashamed to be a woman. I quote, "This thought inspired such a great sense of disgust and sadness in me that I began to despise myself and the whole of my sex as an aberration in nature." The book then goes on to put this reaction through the filter of the virtues of reason, rectitude, and justice. Christine asks the virtues if women should be taught as men are, and why some men think that women should not be educated. Other questions that are explored are the criminality of rape, the natural affinity in women to learn, and their talent for government. She ends with a warning against the lies of slanderers, saying, "Drive back these treacherous liars who use nothing but tricks and honeyed words to steal from you that which you should keep safe above all else, your chastity and glorious good name." This thought process was apparent in all of the female writers that I found, and I was found surprisingly many. I grew up believing that, women didn't read or write. That was it. But clearly, once again, that is a tweaking of history to suit the status quo. But what was disappointing to me in all of these female writings was that they were very careful to advocate for equality in education, but not to in any way suggest that the system, the status quo, is changed. They were tiptoeing around inside the cage that the church had defined for them. And there is strong reason for this. Anyone who stepped just outside of the bounds was declared a heretic and would suffer everything that went together with that judgment. Not pleasant, ever. So the power of the church continues, and until a century later, we meet up with King Henry VIII. Now, he was a force of nature, and in order to be able to marry his passion Anne, he tweaks the doctrine of the church. Now, much is made about this particular passion, movies, literature, etc., but it is Catherine Parr, the last wife of Henry VIII, who has a far more telling voice that echoes through history. Now, she is popularly depicted as this angelic nursemaid to the ailing King Henry VIII. Hallelujah. But in reality, Catherine Parr was an educated woman. She was a scholar. She was an author. She was the first English queen to publish in her own name 2 books. She published in total about 5, and she published original works, prayers. What Catherine of Parr also was a passionate reformer. She was a patron of religious reform. But this passion got her into a bit of a sticky spot. Disgruntled courtiers fermented a plot of heresy against her. But Catherine Parr, being an intelligent woman and drawing on her wisdom and experience of being married twice before, she immediately withdraws to her room, to her sick bed, and she says, she's far too sick, too ill to attend court. So Henry VIII goes to her bedside, where she then uses the tricks of woman, modern woman, ancient woman, in order to appease the ego of the husband, particularly somebody who is so quick to chop off heads as Henry VIII. And she basically says to him that I am but a silly woman. I was merely arguing with you to learn from you and for you to take your mind off your troubles. You are my master and anchor and power on earth next to God. So she makes herself tiny in context of this marriage, which works. She outlives Henry. They are great friends. And she also becomes, importantly, the mentor of Elizabeth I. She ensures that Elizabeth is once again placed in her position in the line of succession, and she mentors Elizabeth I, and under her mentorship, I imagine, Elizabeth I reads Christine de Pizan's book of the City of Ladies, which influences her and says, I'm not getting married because I do not want to be defined by a man. Due to all of this, the Elizabethan period is remembered for peace, prosperity, philosophy, Shakespeare, and science. And while she's remembered by some as more than a man, and in truth sometimes less than a woman, when Elizabeth dies on the cusp of the 17th century, peace and progress seem to follow her to her grave. Witch burnings ramp up, holy wars erupt, civil society sinks into savagery again, people are persecuted for their religious beliefs again, and towards the end of the 17th century, the Catholics and the Protestants paint Europe red. But even here, in this period, I was surprised at the amount of female voices that came out of this trench of time. But once again, disappointed to discover that they still remained very firmly within this cage that society had shaped and built for them. They were very careful to ask for equality within the confines of social acceptance. And they had very polite conversations about education, etc. But about 250 years ago, in France, the woman got so fed up that polite conversations were set aside. Now, 1789 to 90 is known for the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille, and many movies have been made about that. But there is another telling event that gets far less publicity, and that is the Women's March to Versailles. The women go to the market. There is no bread again. The people are starving. The woman gets so irate at the incompetence, the greed, the corruption of the men in charge that they hitch up their skirts and they walk to Versailles, which is about 20 miles away, and they walk in the rain to go and demand change, to demand that something is done about this problem. This does have the result of Louis being dragged off to Paris and signing a decree in which he guarantees liberté, égalité, fraternité for all men, emphasis being on men. Despite the fact that the women were part of this French Revolution, women were still excluded from these concessions for equality and self-governance. During this period, there was a famous playwright, Olympe de Gouges, who was a fierce fighter for women's rights. She was a pamphleteer, so put pamphlets out and hand pamphlets out with everybody. But she also spoke out against the Jacobin terror that arose after the French Revolution. And she famously said that if a woman was allowed to mount the scaffold, she should also be allowed to mount the speaker's platform, because at that point, women were still expected to be silent in society. Olympe de Gouges goes on to write a pamphlet against the Jacobin terror, which I'm going to read to you in its entirety. Now is the time to establish a decent government, whose energy comes from the strength of its laws. Now is the time to put a stop to assassinations and the suffering they cause, for merely holding opposing views. Let everyone examine their consciences. Let them see the incalculable harm caused by such a long-lasting division, and then everyone can pronounce freely on the government of their choice. The majority must carry the day. It is time for death to rest and for anarchy to return to the underworld. The divided French are fighting for 3 opposing governments. Like warring brothers, they rush to their downfall, and if I do not halt them, they will soon imitate the Thebans, ending up by slitting each other's throats to the last man standing. It is time to put a stop to this cruel war that has only swallowed up your treasure and harvested the most brilliant of your young. Blood, alas, has flowed far too freely. For her trouble, she had her head chopped off in 1793. These words strike me as so modern, so relevant, even today. And what is so disappointing is that, as I wrote in a previous book, our progress is nothing but the evolution of throwing stones, spears, arrows, bullets, bombs, rockets, missiles, autonomous killer drones. Same thought process, shinier finishes. The Jacobin terror gives way to Napoleon, who enforces the Napoleonic Code, which sets the rights back of women by 400 years. And that then brings us to 1849, at which point the Assyriologists, the archaeologists are busy digging into this trench and discovering the library of Ashurbanipal. In this period of time of approximately 50 years, this code of repression is ingrained, embedded into society, with a few more tweaks just to suit men, until the whole of society, including women, believed that this is the only way it can be, because it is God's word. God's will is that men are masters and women are nothing but children, that must at all times be looked after by males, at which point we get this idea of the Victorian age of coverture. This image shows from birth to death, a woman is covered, is looked after by a man. At no point in her life is she ever an independent, responsible person, because she is incapable of being that. So at this point in 1849, women had been reduced to, nothing was expected of women. They had been reduced to a pure womb. Their womb had to be pure. That was it. And if you became a fallen woman and your womb was sullied, well, frankly, your life might as well be over, particularly if you happen to not have an inheritance. If you happen to have a nice inheritance, well, then compromises could be made. But otherwise, that was it. If you got married, say you kept your womb nice and pure and you happened to have a nice inheritance and a man decided that you were a viable proposition for marriage, the minute you got married, you lost your money, you lost your body, you lost the fruit of your womb, your children, you lost your personhood. You became part of the man. And then we just question ourselves as to why marriage, the wedding ceremony, we make such a big deal of it. I would say it's to gaslight women. That women just think about this one romantic moment and they don't think about the consequences that follow. In digging down into this trench of time, patterns are revealing themselves, sort of the hypersexualization of powerful women in order to denigrate them. But another thing is coming up that I think is far more important. There are periods of oppression and equality and oppression and equality, and they seem to correlate with periods of steep hierarchy, steep inequality, and equality. Hierarchy, equality, that seem to go together with things like war and famine and pandemics, etc. So during the Victorian era, with the industrialization, we once again get a period of incredibly steep hierarchy. The difference between the rich and the poor is vast. And I think that the oppression of women has more to do with trying to control men than it does with trying to control women. Because when the men at the top take more than their fair share, there comes a point when the bottom becomes restive and we start thinking of the French Revolution. And it is in order to keep these restive men calm that women are oppressed. Because by giving every man possession of a woman, possession of her property, possession of her children, to do with as you please, you appease the innate drive of men to be the alpha. But this thought allows me to think that it gives that old adage of a man's home is his castle a very sinister edge. Because the women and children within the home are now under complete domination of a man. Some of whom we know, even in like modern day, gender-based violence is a problem. But even if you might say, but not all men are like that, even for the kindest man, the most generous man, the idea that a woman should be oppressed, her body should be controlled, her purse should be controlled, her property should be controlled. There is no justification, no matter how many kind and benign rulers in the home there are. This is once again another failure of feminism. We haven't worked on making the idea of a home literally a place of a safe haven for women. A woman's value in the home has never received the full economic weight that it actually gives to society, not just to the man who now has control of essentially servants. It doesn't just give economic freedom to the man in the house, but it supports the entire economy. There has never been a change in the economic system that says, how do we value what a woman does in the home? Instead, what has happened is there is this romantic version sort of this Victorian period, which is coming back into play again today with the surrendered wife movement, in which there is this absolute focus on the old-fashioned family values. This Victorian courtly love, which we see a reflection of in these engagement videos we see online. But it makes nonsense of the fact that once a woman is married, even today, she carries the weight of the burden of maintaining the house, looking after the children, even as she is expected to have a job. So there is no economic structure in which the woman who gets married and looks after the children is in fact paid the value of this service to society. When the surrendered wife movement promotes these old-fashioned family values, you will discover with a little bit of digging that it's usually young women who have managed to snare themselves a much older, richer man. In which case, of course, the whole situation works, but it makes nonsense of the fact that even in our modern age, women who have children have to work 3 jobs in order to be able to afford to feed them, clothe them, educate them. A failure of feminism. We cannot expect men to change things that are good for men. It's not going to happen. Women have got to hold the torch, hand it from person to person and say, what are we going to do so that we do not make less of this idea of women in the home, but that we make more of it? Because under feminism, women at home haven't been elevated at all. A powerful voice comes to us from 100 years ago, 1920s, Virginia Woolf, who understood this idea all too well. In her most famous speech, she writes, in a room of one's own, she concludes that until a woman has possession of property, control of her purse, and control of her body, she has control of nothing. And she gently mocks the idea of the angelic woman, the angel in the house, in a piece she writes in 1929. The angel woman is immensely sympathetic, immensely charming, utterly unselfish. She excelled in the difficult arts of family life. She sacrificed herself daily. In short, she was so constituted she never had a mind, but preferred to sympathize always with the minds and wishes of others. Above all, she was pure. Her purity was supposed to be her chief beauty. And this sentiment is written 500 years after Christine de Pizan wrote pretty much the same thing. And in this context, it's hardly surprising that men and certain women still believe that women are not able to be educated as much as men, cannot possibly be equal to men in all things. There is this growing movement of women who are going back to this highly sexualized, subservient woman because they have seen that the economy doesn't serve women if they go out and become their own person and go and work a job and, heaven forbid, actually have a child. So once again, the behavior of women, I don't think has got anything to do with what women really are, what femininity really is. This persistence of the patriarchy, this persistence of economic repression, of economic control, has made women and continues to make women obsequious, highly sexualized beings, which is great for men. But at the same time, the patriarchy, as we have seen through thousands of years, remains, not because it's successful. In another presentation, I will look at matriarchal societies or societies under the rule of women, and we will see that those societies were far more successful in terms of what we would consider a peaceful, prosperous, equal society. Patriarchies were never that. Patriarchies always were run by males whose only goal was to dominate. And the patriarchy doesn't require anything else of men. We see this even today. The most feckless individuals become leaders of the greatest powers, not because of any defining quality, but purely because they know how to game the system in order to dominate. So we sit in a situation today still based on this patriarchal system in which feckless men attract obsequious women who support their ego, and we have the circular thing in leadership which is leading us all over the edge of a cliff. We are heading, if we look to the Bronze Age, we are heading towards a collapse. Now, depending how old you are, you might say, oh, it's not going to affect me. But people in the know are saying it's going to happen far more quickly than we can imagine. As soon as the links in the chain start breaking, and we see them breaking already today, you're going to see how this interrelated system that we all depend on slowly but surely crumbles. And our children, and definitely our grandchildren, are going to live in that future. And we see from the past how long it takes to reset. It takes hundreds. There are patterns in history where you can see there's thousands of years where the archaeological record goes silent. And the thing that we need to change in this, and the thing that we need to identify, is that feminism's other failure is that it didn't advance. This brings me to, I think, the deepest thing about the failure of feminism. It is the idea that feminism and the feminine brain are one thing, and men and the masculine brain are another thing. But cognitive neuroscience tells us that this is not the case at all. There is no such thing as a male brain and a female brain. But what there is, there's not even a continuum between maleness and femaleness. It's a mosaic. But what there is a feminine thought process and a masculine thought process. And feminism has absolutely become biased towards the masculine thought process. head for a goal, don't care, like move fast, break things, get to the top of the pile, basically. The feminine thought process is more considered, calmer. It takes everything into consideration. And in this I conclude, wisdom has a feminine voice. And this feminine voice has been suppressed by education across centuries. In these words that we say, boys don't cry, don't show your vulnerability, etc. By doing that, we are not just promoting this masculine thought process, but we are also excluding, suppressing our innate ability to be wise, to consider the whole, and to act in benefit to the whole. And the question is, how did we get here? What within our modern period caused this to happen? And here we have to go back in time again. We're going to sort of hop, skip and jump over the Old Testament period, and we're going to jump to 300 years after the birth of Christ. So we're in Rome, in the Rome of Constantine. Constantine's Rome was huge, unwieldy, crumbling at the edges. But inside there was ferment because of the rise of the Christian philosophies. Christianity at that point had not yet been established. There wasn't one thought process behind Christianity. There were many thought processes behind Christianity. But one thing that was apparent was that these early Christians, these early followers of Jesus, walked to their death with no fear. It's a very important point that requires a trench of time of its own. So Constantine, being a philosophical man, says, well, there's only so much you can do to somebody who's not afraid of death. So he changed his mind. He changed his thought process and set in motion a chain of events that brings us to where we are today. He converted to Christianity. He allowed the Christians to practice freely, their faith freely, and then he set about formalizing the Christian faith. And he did this through a whole succession of councils. The councils were made up of men whose thought process was embedded in their time. Men were in charge of everything. Men were naturally the bosses of everything. They were the kings. They were the rulers. Basically, it was a man's world, and women were literally second-class citizens. And it is out of this male thought construct that these various councils made decisions about what Christianity should be. They made choices about the writings that should be included in the Bible. They combined the lot, and Christianity as we understand it today, the Catholic Church as we understand it today, arose out of that. By 380, Christianity was made the state religion. And then, in 382, the Vulgate Bible, translated by St. Jerome, became the Vulgate, the common library, that was read, I would almost say, under duress by everybody in Europe. That was the word. That was the word of the state. It was the word of the Pope, which was the word of God. And within that constraint, Europe's thought process was absolutely cast in tempered steel. Literally. It was shaped by tempered steel. And what's interesting about St. Jerome, as female voices come to the fore, now in this modern age. Now there is that, feminism has managed to achieve that there are female voices who are coming to the fore and looking at this whole history somewhat differently. And they are starting to question St. Jerome, his personality, his character, and how that character integrated itself, ingratiated itself into the library. And right at the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 3, verses 16, there is this very important sentence which is utterly relevant to what we've been speaking about today, in which in the Hebrew it says, woman shall have a strong desire, in other words, sexual desire for her husband. St. Jerome translates that to mean a husband shall have power over his wife. And it is seen that later on in Genesis, St. Jerome correctly translates strong desire. So it's not like he made a mistake. He did this on purpose. And from the research of women who are restudying the divinity and the Bible, etc., they are now seeing that St. Jerome was not terribly fond of women. He had a problem with women. He was psychologically disturbed. And yet here we are, by making that tiny little shift. Women through the centuries have been suppressed by men because God said so. And his word was enforced with savage retribution to anyone who didn't believe it. It might be hard to change your mind on your own, but fear is a great shifter of opinion. We see this even today. But I want to end with a last library, the Nag Hammadi Library, that was found in 1947, I think, in Upper Egypt, in which there were 30 codices with 50 texts. And these show us a completely different kind of Christianity, one that was absolutely excluded from the Bible. I'm going to defer here to another woman's voice. Karen King is a historian of religious studies working in the field of early Christianity. She was the first woman to be appointed to the position of Hollis Professor of Divinity at Harvard University. She considers the codices an intriguing glimpse into a kind of Christianity lost for almost 1,500 years. They present a radical interpretation of Jesus' teachings as a path to inner spiritual knowledge. It rejects his suffering and death as the path to eternal life. It exposes the erroneous view that Mary of Magdalene was a prostitute for what it is, a piece of theological fiction. So here we have the same pattern of sexualization of powerful women arising again. It presents the most straightforward and convincing argument in any early Christian writing for the legitimacy of women's leadership. It offers a sharp critique of illegitimate power and a utopian vision of spiritual perfection. It challenges our rather romantic views about the harmony and unanimity of the first Christians, and it asks us to rethink the basis for the Church's authority. So that's pretty explosive stuff, and it was pretty explosive back when Constantine was busy formalizing the state religion. The powerful feminine voice that is contained in these texts was absolutely contrary to what the men of the time believed about society and their place in it. So the people who promoted this sort of philosophy, they were called Gnostics, they were declared heretics and suffered the fate of everyone who was a heretic. So we're back to the impalings and the burnings and the ripping outs of tongues and so on. Fear changes minds. But then, in 1949, another text is found, another gospel is found, that seems to be related to the Nag Hammadi collection, but wasn't found within it. It was found in a collector's collection in Berlin, and it's called the Gospel of Mary, and it is clear that it is the Gospel of Mary of Magdalene, because the Gospel takes place in context of a post-resurrection conversation, in which Jesus is speaking to the apostles and trying to explain to them the true meaning of his philosophy, what he really means. As the narrative opens, Jesus is engaged in dialogue with his disciples, answering their questions on the nature of matter and the nature of sin. In the conversation, Jesus teaches that the inner self is composed of soul, spirit mind, and a third mind, between the two which sees the vision. So we can see the correlations between what we understand the church to be today, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But in this context, in the way this is described within this gospel, it is something completely different. And this is the way propaganda works. It takes things that seem to be the same and seem to be interrelated, cuts out all the differences in the middle and smushes them together until they seem like one whole and cannot be changed and are absolutely unified. So, in the Nag Hammadi library, this concept of the inner kingdom, which I call wisdom, is the path to joy, transcendence, self-fulfillment. The ability to be wise within yourself, your capacity to generate joy from yourself. That is, according to the Nag Hammadi words and the Gospel of Mary, where you will find your transcendence, if you must. But that went exactly against what the world had become accustomed to under a patriarchal system. Somebody from the outside had to control you. It was not good that you controlled yourself, because people who are self-controlled, well, how could you possibly control them? And particularly people who didn't fear death, like the early Christians didn't fear death. Later Christians fear death. Once again, the propaganda has made its work felt in our thought process. In this Gospel of Mary, then, Jesus leaves. The apostles are upset in that they might have misunderstood Jesus all this time. And Mary says that she had a private conversation with Jesus in which he assured her that her understanding was correct. And she was prepared to share this with the apostles. They balked at this. Andrew said, should we listen to a woman? Peter, even though he knew that Jesus loved Mary more than all the other apostles, said, how is it that Jesus would have spoken in secret to a woman, that he would have imparted information to a woman and not to the men? So they rejected this idea, and the apostles split. It seems that Mary and Levi went off and promoted her understanding, and Peter and the other apostles went and promoted their understanding. And we understand now that Peter was victorious because we now have the Petrine doctrine as the foundation of what it is to be Christian. For me to arrive at this point in digging down this trench of time is a bit surprising. I really didn't think I'd end up with Gospels of Mary and Christianity and so on. But the thing is, this thought process, this formalization of Christianity, which was then imposed upon the European populace with savagery, shaped their thinking for 1,500 years. And it brought us to the Renaissance, which then, the intellectual flowering of Europe, came from this incredibly low base. In the same way that we compare our modern feminist liberties against an incredibly low base of the Victorian woman. But what all of this shows me is that it's really hard to find the problems in our thought process because we're constantly looking at a mirror, the mirror image that society is giving us. It's really hard to find out what it is to be a woman, what it is to be female, what it is to be feminine, because we are still trapped in this system where the patriarchy, the male dominance of thousands of years is telling us what it is to be a woman. And we see this by the influencers today. I mean, always the Kardashians, they come up with this super hyper-sexualized version of being a female. We have still not dug down deep enough. And I think in order to dig deeply into what it is to be a woman, we need to go to cultures outside the constraint of Western thought. We need to go to places where matriarchal societies have been dominant for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so I want to end here with the voices of the woman of the Iroquois. We, the women of the Iroquois, own the land, the lodge, the children. Ours is the right to adoption, life or death. Ours is the right to raise up and depose chiefs. Ours is the right to representation in all councils. Ours is the right to make and abrogate treaties. Ours is the supervision over domestic and foreign policies. Ours is the trusteeship of tribal property. Our lives are valued again as high as man's. This is from the Six Nations, the oldest living participatory democracy on earth. When you want to change your mind, it is quite often that you have to step out of your society. We talk about stepping out of comfort zones, but a comfort zone in this concept is not enough. We need to climb out of the trench. We need to walk away from the dig site. We need to go and find other places, other cultures to dig down into, which is what I intend to do. But I want to end with this idea of an economic structure, that all of what we're seeing, this gender-based discrimination, racially based discrimination, is all part of an economic structure. And ultimately, if we want to change anything, that is the thing we have to change. It is the reward system that defines how we behave. So we have to change what we reward, whom we reward, and how we reward. And this is possible with our technology that we have today. And it's also possible because we have so many people today who are outside of the benefits of this economic structure, which is becoming tighter and tighter as the feudal techno-lords make the hierarchy steeper and steeper, feeding on the time and talents of people like you and I. So there is a way to do this. I've thought about this, and I put this down in my previous book, which I called This is the Perfect Place for Paradise. Now you can download this book for free. The link is down below. And start thinking about where the constraints really are, where the start of the problem really is. My belief, it is in the reward system, the value system itself, the things we are prepared to pay somebody money for. If you do want to hear another presentation from me, please subscribe, like, leave a comment. Comments are so important. And then hit the bell, because these presentations will come up only gradually. And until then, remember, your thought process, your thoughts are helping to build the future. Make a wise, positive, beneficial contribution.